Hello, everybody. Good evening. We will start with our third lecture in Ringvorlesung series, Unsettled. My name is Bojana Kunst. I'm one of the organizers of this series, together with Francesca Raimondi, who is also here with us, and Sandra Noeth, who is unfortunately today absent due to the cold. And I am very, very happy that I can welcome Valeria Graziano, who will be with us today, and that I can introduce shortly Valeria to us, who is a cultural theorist and activist, and I also must say a very dear colleague. And Valeria's inspiring and passionate work I really deeply appreciate, and I'm always somehow following it with the readings, and in the last time also with a lot of discussions, which are all very inspiring. Valeria is currently based in Rijeka, in Croatia, and has been before a postdoctoral fellow at the universities of Middlesex and Leuphana, and a research fellow at the Center for Post-Digital Culture in Coventry University. And her work is strongly, I could say, dedicated to the micro-political practices with the intention to foster a creative redistribution of power and reclaim the politicization of pleasure in our modes of cultural and political work. And in that sense, Valeria's work opens also an insight into what organization and working together can do, and is for me always a reason to keep some optimism. And her activism and writing shows us how it is possible to resist, I think, the flows of capitalist creative industries, and how it is also possible to imaginatively and collaboratively work in our cultural, social, and political life towards different values and with different desires as the ones who are guiding current institutional and productive processes. And in this way, Valeria studies and engages with collectives, occupations, also with networks, and actually unsettle a bit the meanings given to them by the prevailing modes of working. And that's why she was also over the years involved in numerous initiatives for institutional change across the cultural sector and social movements like Pirate Care, who she did together with Tomislav Medak and Marcel Mars, and many other projects. So thank you very much, Valeria, for being with us today, and we are really looking forward to listening to you.
Thank you, Bojana. Thank you, Francesca, Sandra, Igor, and Antigone, also from HTA, who are making this encounter possible. To everyone in the room with us, with whom I cannot see, unfortunately, and for creating this warm atmosphere despite the cold times where we are, that we are traversing. And the screens that we also must traverse in our own ways. I guess my work tries often to start with practices in some ways.
Recording in progress.
Oh, recording in progress. Got it. Yes. Okay, so I was just, as a way of introduction, trying to say that I often laugh when people say I'm a theorist, but then I started to realize that this is probably a correct interpretation insofar as theorists are people that whose favorite mode of thinking starts with other people's practices. Whereas probably philosophers' favorite way of thinking starts with other people's concepts. And so insofar of that, if that's definition, I can work with that because very much I keep trying to return and try to think with others around possibilities that we have to construct different ways, different possibilities of organization, of organizing as an activity. And to do so, I often find myself looking into archives of struggles that maybe have been neglected and we forgot maybe for a while. So I come out of this project Pirate Care, which occupied me for the better most of the time in the past 4 years. We started a little bit before the pandemic, and then it really kind of, many of the topics that I was trying to think through exploded and resonated with what the world was starting to be impacted by. And the thing with care, which I'm not going to go into tonight at all, but I just want to mention this because it's kind of like the prequel to what I'd like to, the work I'm would like to share tonight, which is very much in progress. So you will see there's many fissures, and it's a pleasure to have some feedback from all of you. But I just realized I'm not finding care particularly effective to grasp a number of things that I think we need to confront, because care has such a broad capacity. It's a very spacious term, and it is also a very warm term that tends to create its own temperature where things starts to simmer, and it steers things towards ethics a lot. But there is a definition from Anne-Marie Moll, who is a kind of science ethnographist who basically started to explore care as a mode of practice that at some point inevitably starts to confront the need of tinkering, of basically having to find hacks to things or processes or tools, just having to make somehow make interventions in the operations and protocols that we are, and the knowledges that we use to kind of make them fit the specificities of a situation, right? It's pragmatics. So this was somehow in the back of our mind when our kind of health crisis exploded, for lack of better terms, right? And thinking about health and healthcare, it becomes very apparent very quickly that health is a very difficult notion to organize around. There's even a number of scholars, and I think it's going to grow, luckily, that are really problematizing health as a concept that tends to usher in all kinds of normative and moralizing stuff that become very untractable very quickly. And yet we cannot really give up on the term, right? So at some point I came across a quote by David Harvey that really anchored for me why I was feeling so uncomfortable with trying to think, with grasping how we could organize collectively around a good notion of care. And David Harvey basically nails it when he says, under capitalism, to be sick basically means that you don't have the capacity to work. And then I realized that this quote by Harvey is also the starting point for an essay by Lauren Berlant, which is called Slow Death, Sovereignty, Obesity, and Lateral Agency, which inaugurated for me some thinking that I would like to share with you tonight around the possibility of recasting a number of problems that we are in the company of through the lenses of byproduction. So what I will do in my presentation, just to share with you a bit of the scaffolding, I will briefly introduce what Lauren Berlant was trying to touch upon in her essay. And then I will have the presentation in 2 segments. The first part, I will look at the practice from the archive of struggles that comes from Italy in the 70s, actually from very close to home. I'm from Torino, so it's something that happened in my hometown, and I will share a bit more about that. And it's a specific technique for organizing around healthcare. And the second part I will hopefully be able to tease out why I think this could be an excellent point. This practice, which is called instructions to the double, can be a good point of entry for maybe theorizing a little bit more about byproduction as a regime of practice that we might want to cultivate, experiment with, see where it takes us. The second part will be a lot more speculative than the first, by the way, so bear with me. Also, a bit of a note, I'm aware that sometimes because of my accent, it seems like I'm saying bioproduction, but it's not, it's bi, like B, Y, sorry. So it's like the lateral production, or what in many Latin-based languages would be connoted as a sub-production, in Italian sottoprodotto, sottoproduzione, and so forth. And in English language, which is quite interesting, actually, it's connoted as something that is aside, so byproduction. Okay, so I will start to share my screen now, I think. I hope this works. Okay. So Lauren Berlant, in her essay, Slow Death, Sovereignty, Obesity, and Lateral Agency, basically is looking at the so-called obesity crisis in the US, where 1 in 4 adults has issues of the kind related to this condition. And a few points of this essay, which it's really rich, and I invite every one of you to read, is that the condition she defines as low death, it's a kind of violence that we should better grasp as an endemic problem, not as an epidemic, following Foucault. So an endemic problem means a violence that is low enough that always feels like it's always been there. It's almost become environmental. It's a temporality that is so slow that it becomes spatialized. And what she touches upon is that often to try and mobilize activists use this notion of crisis, and they have been using this also addressing obesity in the US. However, crisis, she argues, conjures up a different temporality, because crisis is the one concept that we often turn to understand something that hits us strongly and brings unintended consequences that really unsettle us, unsettle our bodies in a palpable way. Whereas, but the problem with crisis is that it tends to omit all these forms of catastrophe that the majority of the world is comfortable with. And those are often stuck in different registers. So Berlant argues that one of the problems in activating politically around obesity is that no one who was making these decisions meant to do anything to harm individuals or the working class population's bodies. The aim was to control international markets, bankrupt struggling Southern and Pacific Rim production communities, and drive food prices down. But no one meant to fatten up the world population scarily. So we don't have a villain, as in the classical story here. And at the same time, the problem still exists, even though nobody really conjured it up as the way that probably conspiracy theorists would love us to be able to think in that kind of direct way. And yet, sorry, there you go. So she begins to map what could be a corresponding agency, which she names lateral agency, that could confront something that is not a product of will, so to speak. And the way she puts it is that we need better ways to talk about activity oriented towards the reproduction of ordinary life, where these changes around obesity in this case are taking place. And And she ends on this note, which I found very, very rich. So that we need to grasp the not necessary continuity between pragmatic life making and accretive life building gestures and tracks, the relation of that activity to the attrition of the subject. So on the one hand, she's saying lateral agency, it's something that is extremely pragmatic. It has to do with things that people do half-heartedly while they're making their life. And eating and sex are in the realm of these kind of small pleasures that people use to produce themselves in the world in a state of what she calls self-abeyance, which means basically that you're not claiming ownership of the self. While at the same time, people also carry out activities that are life building, so that they're more intentional or directed towards a will. And there is a fissure, there is a gap between these two modes that we all mobilize in everyday existence to make our ordinary lives. And that's exactly where she places this potential of lateral agency to become something of a starting point. So my theory of byproduction that I will share with you tonight takes its move in trying to engage with the lateral agency and further the intuitions of Laurent Berlant in a way that we can start to conceive this lateral agency or this byproduction as operating at scales that are not only infrapolitical, that are not only perhaps effective at the level of the subject or the body understood as a singularity. Okay. So between theory and practice that I was gesturing before, that I often start to think with practices. So the bridge between theory and practice, as Vijay Prashad put it, it's organization. So I'm gonna share with you a story that comes from the Italian healthcare movements that were active in the 60s and 70s in the country. So a bit of an intro to this particular story. So Italy is a weird kind of case that is studied by public health scholars because there is quite a low investment in public health compared to the longevity of its inhabitants, if we take longevity as one of the markers to start to speak about health. And today it still has the longest life expectancy within the EU. Also, it is the second country that managed politically to get to a public health system that is universal and free at the point of use, and it's financed by general taxation. And universal means that it's not only conceived for citizens, but anyone who is on the territory and can access the service, migrants included. This was the idea behind the struggles that led the country to have a national health system in 1978. And this was, as I said, the second one after the UK, which inaugurated this possibility in 1948. So the movements got to the kind of law quite late. And 1978 was kind of already a moment when the global financial markets were traversing the petrol crisis. So it was a moment of economic crisis. And so the spirit of the universality and of the system was pretty much very short-lived. But still, this is an interesting story to share because it was one of the first instances where care services were imagined as non-corporativist, which means trying to delink the fact that one is in a specific profession or work, and that usually in the previous models would be where you would get your insurance from in this very kind of sector-specific mutual aid societies and the forth. And it was, so the healthcare movements were quite composite. And this also was probably why they managed to be so interesting. We had the radical psychiatry segment is often identified with Franco Basaglia In Trieste, we had radical groups like the ones led by Giulio Maccacaro, Medicina Democratica. There were people like Laura Conti, who were one of the first environmentalist activists in the country. There was a feminist segment, which was very, very busy and active to pass abortion laws and promote reproductive rights. And then there was the birth of what is called occupational therapy by Iva Roddone, who is one of the protagonists of my story that we'll share. But collectively, all of these segments, as Chiara Giorgi helpfully summarized, invented a system of service delivery and institutional arrangements that, first of all, was able to push a vision of medicine as non-hierarchical, so to mitigate the hierarchy between doctors and patients. It was a model that was radically decentralizing the idea of services and health organizations, so very much understanding them as part of territories and environments. It was absolutely placing the emphasis on prevention rather than intervention in medicine. And finally, it had a political vision of health. They were really keen of articulating health as a common good, and most importantly, as an integrated state of physical and psychic conditions, of individual and collective dimensions of existence, and one that was linking social and environmental processes as well. And this is also interesting because within their concept of health and healthcare, the environment understood as the ecosystems that sustain our lives were very present. So much so that I recently found that out, the biggest expense for industries in Italy throughout the 70s, in response to these movements and the pressure that they were able to bring, was actually environmental remediations. This was like by far the highest number in their budgets. All these extremely polluting practices from the 50s were were mitigated and were stopped in the course of a couple of decades. All right, so I mentioned briefly a figure that I would like to return to because here he is, because he was the creator of this performative methodology, which is called the instructions to the double, that I would like to share tonight. So his name is Iva Roddone. He's a doctor from Turin. Incidentally, he was a member of the Communist Party as well, very much a Gramsciist in his understanding of politics. And I think in a relevant way, he was also a partisan during the Second World War, and a good friend of Italo Calvino, who writes him as a character called Kim in one of his books. And the book is also dedicated to Oddone. The two were friends throughout their lives. And it's interesting because in the book, the character of Kim behaves in such a way that people attribute to Oddone in his real life. He's an intellectual type that is kind of annoying, and he goes around asking the other partisans who are not perhaps middle class in origin, so they come from all kinds of venues of life. He goes around to ask them why they became anti-fascist, and he's truly interested in understanding what are the motivations that bring people to commit to specific life choices. So after the war, Iva Roddone he finishes his studies in medicine. He starts to practice, as I mentioned, in Torino. And Torino, at the time, is one of the biggest industrial centers of Italy, specifically because of the presence in town of Fiat cars that was, at the time, employing, I think it was over 100,000 factory workers in the train working, in car production and engine productions and other heavy machinery, basically. So we're talking about heavy metal industry in the city of Torino. Oddone begins to become interested in the condition of work of the factory from the perspective of a doctor. And he soon starts to collaborate with the unions in town, and specifically a group of unionists called the Quinta Lega Mirafiori, who were a really kind of interesting and militant collective of organizers within Fiat Car. And he starts to work with the unions to try and formulate for the union what could be a health policy for the union, like an official healthcare position that they would push. And he did so by interviewing people, but it kind of has to start from scratch, because at the time there was not such an idea of occupational therapy or ergonomics or any kind of scientific knowledge that would look at the conditions of work from the perspective of healthcare. So in 1968, he actually drafted, through interviews with workers, this that I'm showing here, this L'ambiente di lavoro, which was a booklet, a very interesting kind of publication, because it was distributed in millions of copies, by the way, and it was extremely influential, was translated, I think, in at least 7 languages. It became like a cornerstone of how occupational medicine looks at problems. And he basically divided up issues in 4 groups. Factors of risk. The first group would be looking at environmental issues that are broader than just your where you work. So things like noise or the temperature or the ventilation and humidity, the light conditions where you live, work, and dwell. The second group was concerned with production-related hazards. So typically smoke, chemical vapors, and such. The third group of risk he identified, it's sheer physical fatigue. And the fourth in this booklet looks at anything that is not bodily, but that still brings in factors such as stress, anxiety, monotony and boredom, repetitiveness, which also damage the mental condition of workers. It's interesting to notice that even though we're talking, this is written in 1968, the first edition, and it will be reprinted up until the 2000s. But he already, predicted in this booklet that the first 3 factors of risk for workers in the next decades were going to shrink, whereas the fourth order of factor, that is the mental one, was gonna explode. So just to give you a sense, this is the size of Fiat cars at the time. This is the inside, where he could not have access. And he had to do the interviews outside the gates to try and understand even how to conceptualize health for workers. And to give you a sense of the magnitude of the problem, today we have in Italy 3 deaths per day, work-related deaths per day, and around 800,000 injuries per year. In the 70s, a rough statistic would give you 3 deaths every 2 hours at work and 1 accident per minute, accident resulting in permanent injury and disability, 1 per minute. So when we're talking about a class war, with these numbers, we are quite close to a proper level of conflict. In between the 50s and the 70s, there were 97,500 deaths and over 1.5 million of permanent disables in heavy industry in Italy. But Fiat was also a lot more. It was one of the most interesting experiments politically, for better or worse, determining not only the trajectory of Italian politics per se, but I would say broader conversations within left-wing Marxism and workers' struggles internationally. Now, the instruction to the double are the culmination of this process that O'Donnell started wanting to find a way to go beyond this, to really provide some sort of basis to articulate what is wrong with work, what is the problem with work, and why it is not compatible with a health situation. He was a teacher at occupational medicine in the faculty of Torino. And so the way he started to, so because I mentioned before, so he didn't have access to knowledge, he didn't have access to the factory. All he could do was to work with with specific workers. So in 73, he managed to activate one of the many courses that are called 150 hours of study. And this is a great story, but I'm not gonna go much into that, just to give you a sense of what this context for the instruction to the doubles is, because otherwise it doesn't really make sense. So the 150 hours for studying was one of the victories of the heavy metal, how do you call it? Heavy metal workers segment of the unions, who basically won this in the national contract of workers, this right for everyone to have 150 hours paid for by the employees for studying whatever they want. And this would be matched by another 150 that they would put in from their private time. So anyway, 300 hours would be the total amount. But the super powerful thing is that this is so far away from adult education, continuing education, all the blurb, because it was self-directed. Unions, workers' association, informal association, like universities included. But anyway, the worker had absolute autonomy to decide how she or he or they wanted to invest their time and to learn what. And incidentally, this is why I put these pictures here. This was also a really great resource for the nascent feminist studies in the country that had nowhere to go in official institutions of knowledge. And that's how they started, by organizing 150 hours where housewives would attend, and then they would never leave. Basically, they became activists through that. Anyhow, so instruction to the doubles or instruction to the doppelganger, I'm not sure which translation fits it better. I think both, but maybe doppelganger is clearer for some of you, was a method that O'Donnell kind of developed for speaking with around 15 workers from Fiat, going beyond the problem that they had so far. So he would usually go to them and interview them as a technical guy. So he would ask all these questions that the doctor usually asks you. And they would try to talk back to him, talking basically Marxism, like throwing at him like the problems of having to struggle basically to survive and organize strikes in the factory. So they had a major issue of language, and they couldn't understand each other, both O'Donnell and the doctors on one side and the workers on the other. And so in the end, out of frustration, I imagine, Ivar O'Donnell proposes a game. And the game is a game to them. And he says, okay, so give me all the informations that would allow me, imagine that I look like you, and you give me all of the informations that would allow me to replace you without anyone noticing tomorrow at work. And I recently interviewed one of the people that was one of the participants to this experience, who is called Gianni Marchetto, and to whom I send greetings in case he's connected. And his particular instructions are also printed in this book, which is Esperienza operaia, coscienza di classe e psicologia del lavoro. They collected 4 of these instructions to the doppelganger, or the double. And he was telling me, Gianni was telling me that at the beginning, the proposal of sharing instructions really failed. They had to redo them over and over again. And Odone would just interrupt, no, I don't need the storytelling. You're telling me the story. I want instructions as if we are at the driving school and I'm your instructor, and you need to just tell me, how do you drive the car? And you just need to tell me. You put the keys in, you turn it in, you whatever you do, you with the mirrors and the seats, all the things I never do, and then I get in trouble. But you get the idea. And then Gianni also was telling me that he was challenging Ivar Odone, because he was saying, okay, we can maybe do that. We can maybe share very specific instructions that would allow other people to replace us. But this surely can only work for very simple jobs as ours, because we are at the chain, at the factory chain. So we are stuck in these repetitive tasks. And those tasks are designed by the management specifically to be extremely parcelized and simple, that even a monkey could execute them. And so the story goes that Odone challenged Gianni Marchetto to participate in other of such workers' inquiries. And one of them was mapping nursery teachers, surgeons, bank clerks, and they even did workers' inquiry in an entire working class neighborhood in Torino with with thousands of inhabitants. So they really found something there that kind of worked to break this problematic of the language, the communal language. And I'll go back to that in a minute. The title of the book is kind of interesting too, because I was asking about this to Gianni too, this idea of workers' experience and how does this proletarian experience happens. And basically the answer to that was that instructions to the double, the way they devised it as a technique in this game was to break it up into 4 dimensions plus 1 that they think make up the bulk of what is the experience of workers. First of all, there is the relationship with machine and job description. So here we have the tension between the project, which is abstraction, and the pragmatic of life. The second level is mapping the relationships with hierarchy. So you get along with your boss, you don't, you challenge them, you lick their asses, whatever you do. Third dimension looks at their relationship with your peers, your colleagues. And the objective there would be to build a first layer of networks through proximity that could allow people to start organized. And the fourth is asking workers to give instructions around their relationship with organizations. And by this, they meant political organizations, such as the party or the union at the time. But to put it more broadly, this would basically map the articulation and coordination with more remote politics that belong to other social contexts too. So to this 4 dimension, they add a 5th one, which is the personal history of the individual. And through these 5 points, they would really be able to produce a new, an extremely thick and idiosyncratic profile of what was the trajectory and the state and the subjectivity of the workers involved. The objective, this is how Ivar Odone conceptualized this. So what he envisioned the instructions to the double to achieve would have been an extended scientific community of workers, students, sociologists, psychologists, doctors, economists, trade unions, magistrates, legislators who meet to discuss concrete situations and ways of doing research. And I call these people, he calls these people raw experts or nodal men who tend to structure information differently in the minds of others. So it's a project of restructuring knowledge production. It's a knowledge that wants to put science at the center of a political formation that does not exist. We don't have such institution. We have to imagine it. And incidentally, as an aside, this might probably have something to speak to the current problem that many people are facing vis-a-vis scientific knowledges and politics, for lack of a more precise word. And I get out of the present again and back into the archive. So what's in this instruction to the doppelganger? What's in the instruction to the doubles? They're very beautiful stories, but one in particular that also Johnny makes me laugh because he was like, no, you have to read that one. This is the most beautiful one. Is the one by someone called Cesare Cosi, which is also printed in the book. And what comes out there is that the ways workers were surviving the grinding of the factory and the grinding that the factory has both on bodies and psychic life and their psychic life was pretty amazing. So in the factory line, they would work in teams and they were able to produce a knowledge whereby they could either speed up or slow down production, so that they would carve out moments of having breaks, like a cigarette or a coffee, more often than the ones that they were officially allowed to go to pee or such. And they would do all kinds of hacking of tools to improve the safety or reduce the fatigue, as if like they would chop off parts of very heavy equipment because just to save energy. There's all kinds of super interesting things there. The best part is that Fiat managers knew that, and they knew that people would politicize this. They would stay long enough in a team, so they would rotate them regularly. About every 2-3 months, they would just reshuffle some people around. And so the teams also invented ways to pass on this knowledge of how you do it, because the trick is that you can literally produce this extra time only if everybody slows down or speeds up at the same time. It cannot be an individual approach. It wouldn't work. And unfortunately, just to conclude my first session, this legacy of the instructions to the double was finally it stayed a minority position within the major trade unions in Italy. It was not picked up. The experience kind of exploded in 1973. The book was published, but then what Johnny was talking about in terms of like a muscular approach to struggling prevailed. A lot of the most important trade union position and victories at the time were also based on pretty much confrontation. So you strike or you manage to go on strike. If the production line is too heavy, then you demand that new people would be brought in the team. So you can have maybe 1-2 members more. So yeah, it kind of stayed relegated to the side of history. And at the same time, I think it still yields some interesting kind of seeds for thinking about how we can confront the extreme toxicity that the way in which industrial production conceives of its doing, or of itself as a regime of practice, which is basically, in essence, vis-a-vis health and the monotony and drudgery of work. It's not that different. It has not evolved since Taylorism introduced this idea of the one best way, right? And the interest in workers is basically as points of energy. There is no active interest in reshaping the division of labor within production. I guess that's what I'm getting at. So what the workers involved in the instructions to the double, what they were achieving, I think, just to go back to the image, sorry, very quickly, is, here we go. It's a map of their work environment that would be a much more elaborate version of this poster, but basically it's a map of all of the byproducts that the factory disavowed. And in doing so, it also introduced a regime. So they were looking at things like environment, work, and body as a continuum, as related factors interplaying. And in the instructions to the double, there are, I think, and I will tell you a bit more what I mean by this in a minute, but there are two regimes of byproduction at play. The first one is that they were saying there's always the best one in every team of work. There's always the one that is fastest. It's, you know, he or she is the smart cookie in the room, or the fittest. And one of the points of the instructions was to actually hijack this idea and collectivize the knowledge for making sure that everybody knows what are the best ways to do things, and also to problematize the idea that there is one best way to do things. The second one, so it's kind of like a hijacking of a specific regime of production of subjectivity. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And on the second level, there was the instructions to the double inaugurate a regime of byproduction by virtue of reappropriating the knowledges, the specialist knowledges of both doctors and managers and engineers and all these kind of specialist figures. There is a very interesting anecdote as well that I can share briefly. So Cesare Cosi, whose story I mentioned earlier, he would always go to the office that it was called the Office for Analysis of Work, which was the one that would produce the official timings for each movement that the worker has to sustain. They would study the work process. And he would insist to get their tables and their techniques, and to know exactly why would you time a gesture like this 2.5 seconds? What's the criteria? I want to know. I want to learn. Where do you get this from? And by the way, I'm not going to go into that, but most of this comes from the US. They're usually kind of US inflected modes of organizing. But anyway, so he slowly obtained all of these spreadsheets, and he made a room within the union which recreated in 3D all of the knowledge of the managers. And people would go there and kind of look at these random numbers that would shape their lives and their health, and basically realize that the worker that is in the mind of the chronometrist, that was the figure of the person that would time your work. The chronometrist always thought about the best results, the fastest person, and he would absolutely disavow all the other conditions that might impact the average production rhythm and the capacity of the body. And this reappropriation, incidentally, it's not the same, I don't think, and I'm happy to discuss this further, but it's not the same as what Audre Lorde meant, that you cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. I think the implications are very much different insofar as they were trying to understand the nexus between what is produced, which is cars, and the city, and the production of subjects, and the production of disease and hazard for the body in a conjunction. And you cannot, I think, appreciate those links without performing like this jujitsu move towards the governing rationale, basically, that you're subjected to. Okay. Yeah, maybe I'll add just one more thing that I think, again, I hope I bring home how concrete this experience is, because it's really embodying an attempt to fix the toxicity, which is environmental, so all the fumes and the chemicals that were being produced, with a state of chronic fatigue that aged the workers, with an idea of what kind of shrinking of mental capacity. This was the fear by then, and there were a lot of workers with depression and so forth. So they were trying to establish this link for the first time, and they were doing that as a group of workers themselves, unionists and doctors, which I think is quite interesting in its own right. But yeah, just to conclude this first session very quickly, and then I'll draw my conclusions to a bit more speculatively around byproduction. But there is a notion that I learned through Gianni Marchetto, who also learned it from Iva Rodone. So this is our little chain of transmission here, which is called the notion of performance regime of 133. So 133 is a number that is used at the basis of all in the organization of industrial productions to measure the fatigue to which you can subject your worker. Okay. And it turns out that our organs have this amazing capacity that if they're stimulated or needed, incentivized in some way, they can improve their basic metabolic functions to a maximum, though, of 1/3. So if your maximum at a kind of rest state is 100, if you really try, you can push your organs to perform to 133.3333, but anyway, 1/3. So 133, that was the golden rule for designing the workload for people. Now, today, what we know from the current Fiat car plant in the south of Italy, that is in a place called Pomigliano, Pomigliano, I think. This workload, it's of 164. So that means that basically people are pushed like they were as athletes, except that athletes have very short careers, first of all, and then they perform just a few races per year, or whatever performances, and also they come with a full fitness regime. You would have someone that looks at the way you eat, and you have your physiotherapist and psychological coach and the forth. So yeah, of course, none of that is available to a working class experience of work. Okay. Bojana, how am I doing with time? Or can anyone please help me out? Because I have a full screen to share. So
we are, it's 1 hour. We still have half an hour more. It would be nice to stay a little bit for a discussion also. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I will very quickly maybe take 10 minutes to explore what I've been busy thinking about based on the instructions to the double. So I think health is an excellent entry point, for me at least it was, to start to think to a class of objects whose mode of existence in the world should primarily be grasped as byproducts. And I borrowed the expression mode of existence from Gilbert Simondon, who first introduced it to open up a space for articulating the specificities of technological objects first. And I take byproduct pretty much from a layman use of the term. So there's nothing esoteric in the way I'm using this. Byproducts are very much used to describe what Ansing called the non-design effects of systems, right? There's always a non-designed effect. Systems are always somehow open and complicating things. Incidentally, I don't know how relevant it is, but my PhD was actually in business and management, which always makes me laugh because I don't know how to make money and I don't know how to organize, not even my life. But anyway, but I did spend some time, that's what it means, with some of that specific literature. And byproducts are very, very present there because, of course, they come around as something that you can try to optimize and get a little bit more money for, or their costs. They are something that you have to try and deal in other ways. And this literature is kind of always very banal. It always shocks me how there's books and books describing the banalities of bureaucratic drudgery. But anyway, for what's worth, I found a very basic and standard definition of a byproduct in accounting book, training book, which says that a byproduct is a secondary unit produced in a joint production process that has little value in relation to the main product being produced. And in other words, it's a unit that is created inadvertently during the process of manufacturing another product. And then the example that they give is really like funny because it seems like they write for children is, you know, the farmers, for example, that want to produce milk, but then they end up having manure, you know, the cow's shit. What do they do with that? And then they explain you how you can maximize that. And then the chapter that tells it says, unfortunately, not all byproducts have the same salability. So, for example, what do you do if your byproduct is nuclear waste? Then it's a problem because, of course, you have to factor in the cost of this highly specialized storage that needs to take place. Except that even in nuclear, in the case of nuclear waste, and especially in the case of nuclear waste, to have an employee dispose of it even safely, it's not the end of the story, and it cannot be. So byproducts, in a way, introduce this question of the fractal nature of production. And in political ecology, this is becoming more and more of an important element from which to think and rethink the world. I'm not going to go into this too much, but in a number of theories of how to confront, how to think the ecological collapse that we are immersed in, it seemed to me interesting that one of the main ways it's a reconsideration and actually an inclusion on various registers of practice of our byproducts. And I'm saying something very, I think, intuitive. So we find this as a very core principle of permaculture in movements such as Via Campesina, the right to repair, many other initiatives. many knowledges are based in indigenous word making practices, the growth, Gaia, deep ecology approaches. Like, I think it's a very transversal principle that we can take away with us. And while looking at this, I was trying to always not use looking at the ecology, nature, or whatever nature-related problem in ways that relegate nature again to a romantic function or a kind of symbolic function. But really, as a materialist, how is this a principle that we can actually appropriate in terms that are kind of less literal than just making compost out of our peels and something like that? What I think, and for me, the answer is yes, insofar, and this is where I'm gonna end on quickly, is that byproduction is a way for me to shift from the notion of byproduct, which is an object and is with its own mode of existence in the world, to byproduction as a regime of practice that does not need to be unconscious, first of all, and second of all, does not need to be unavoidable in the sense of being staged only in one way. So going back to this idea of Berlant, that there is a non-necessary continuity between pragmatic and accretive functions of making ordinary life happen. Another way to say this, I think, would be with Marx, when he writes that every social process of production is at the same time a process of reproduction. And this quote has been explored and very important for a number of feminist reflections on externalities to which social production has been confined. But for me, the key of byproduction, if anything, is to unlock that this at the same time, this conjunctive, it's idiosyncratic, it is specific to instances. It's pragmatic in the sense that it's geared at solving problems that belong to idiosyncratic temporality. It's not there is no blueprint. So byproduction can be thought as the organizational function, to borrow from Walter Benjamin, of any process of production, okay? Mm. Yeah, I have maybe a couple more minutes to bring it full circle, to say that elsewhere, so on the one hand, there is a body of scholars that are looking at political ecology that have interesting ideas around how to rethink externalities and reconfigure our social metabolism in ways that account for them and sustain them in different ways. And on the other hand, perhaps not surprisingly, but the second body of knowledge where byproduction it's absolutely hunting the scene are scholarly speculations around the productivity of desire and pleasure, and especially in a queer theory tradition. And let me return in closing to Laurent Berlant, where they say, referring to Yves Sedgwick, that if desire fails to find objects adequate to its aim, its errors can still produce pleasure. And this quote continues basically exploring the specificities of this desire that doesn't have any institution where to exist. This is why it has problems actualizing itself in pleasures, because and these institutions, these forms of organizations, I think we stand to invent. And this could be a political project that opens up the space for a different understanding of activism, which I'm increasingly uncomfortable with this notion, but just to know what we're talking about, or styles of militancy that we inherited from the past century, because it has to do with what Marie-Hélène Samboursier has named regimes of the production of identities. No? And this is also a major theme of how do we deproduce ourselves from given given modes of producing our identities. I think I will end here and perhaps return to some examples in discussion or in other occasions. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Valeria. Thank you. Maybe if you can come back with stopping the screen sharing, it would be
yes.
nice. Then we can see you
I
better.
thought I did, but I...
Yeah, now you are back. Yeah, great. Thank you a lot. Thank you very much. Now it's time for questions for all the participants. So if you want, you can ask, you can also write in the chat and we will just collect it so as you like. We don't have a lot of time, so be courageous and just ask because I don't want that we go classical way. I also have some questions, but I can wait. And if there is somebody who would like from the audience also to just ask, please just go. We have 20 minutes to discuss. Maybe we warm up the discussion first and then. Thank you very much, Valeria. I have so many thoughts and questions with your lecture, so it will resonate later. So I don't know actually where to start, but now when you came at the end to this, the notion of desire and also in the relation to queer and so on, I was thinking how to return back this to the example or to the rethinking of the archive to which you went to understand what were the practices actually in the 70s and so on. Because this whole operation, which is extremely interesting from today's perspective also because it's so actual, but nevertheless, it was somehow, you were talking about hijacking a specific regime of subjectivity, which was built around a specific understanding of labor also in a factory, which at that time was already having a crisis of Fordism, post-Fordism and all that. And it's very interesting that all these games and what you explained, they were also played at a very different levels, not just at the level of workers, also hard workers, managerial system. So actually how to hijack this regime of subjectivity. And I was just thinking if we could speculate how to link this, like what would this booklet look like if it would be about the worker today, maybe not in industry, but like the worker to which a lot of our participants are belonging or will belong. So how would this booklet look like? And I think it has something to do with your speculation at the end about desire, because there is this kind of a huge focus on working or hijacking also the desires and the way how do we work. So could we maybe a little bit develop more on that? That was my feeling that you are hinting in this direction, but there was no time actually maybe to have this speculation about it.
Okay, yes, thank you, Bojana, for breaking the ice. Absolutely, this is somehow the hint that I hope it opens up responses from others, because I think that I also like to leave it a bit under trace. How you apply archives to the present condition is always such it's too intractable as a question, because hopefully if they work, I think it's through resonance. So they have to implicate each one of us in their own ways or not at all, if the taste is not. But this technique, it also in very minor way, it is applicable and to today's insofar as if we agree with the vision that the whole society has become a factory in post-Fordism, which is one of the hypotheses of post-workerists who are very much linked with the struggles of Torino, then we're all workers even when we're not. informal salaried arrangements with an employer. And we are in that key implicated bodily, both along these 4 factors of risk, which are all very much part of everyday ordinary experiences, I would say. In terms of the parameters of instructions to the double, I have tried to use the technique in one workshop that I gave recently for the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Rijeka. And everybody was an artist or cultural worker, so freelancing, 3 jobs going at the same time, And it was a great starting of conversations, because it really forced people to talk about, relationship with machine, go, relationship with the hierarchy, with peers, with the, with your environment. And it's not that dissimilar probably to a consciousness raising approach that comes from the feminist experiences that I know has been important in recent years for organizers. But you really feel that providing these minor keys for starting to conceive organizing might be a place to start. I don't know. What was your thinking in this?
I would agree very much. I recognized a lot. I was just thinking how it also replies on another way of how to say body is curing itself from the disease of work, which could be very problematic, and it's very individualized in our society. No? And that means, by example, with different courses of meditation, settling into yourself, and so on, which is also, but this kind of technique or this kind of method which you present is really connected, and this is very interesting with this, not just stepping on the place of another, but it has this very emancipatory effect because it's really a transfer of knowledge and even bodily knowledge. And this is extremely interesting. It's really becoming, for me, when I was listening to you, I was very fascinated how fast it becomes, not maybe the word collective is not right, but it fast becomes a social practice. It's really an invention of a social practice. And this is, for me, a way actually really how to tackle these problematics also with the desire and the way how do we work. So I read it extremely actual. That's why I was just trying to see if you already, it's not just how pragmatically we can try it, but there is something which somehow resists the individualization and singularization of health in a contemporary society. We have a common discourses, common therapeutic practices and so on, but it's very singularized, it's very individualized. It's also professionalized in that sense, of course. And this is interesting for me.
And absolutely. And this is for me the takeaway also from the workshop is that it was a great experience, but the part that was hard, actually, I was going to say, it's when you start to think, okay, we now did we initiated some conversations, identified some issues, and then you start to say, okay, this is about organizing. Mm-hmm. And I want to insist, like, by production, for me, it's not interesting if it does not operate at the level of helping to conceptualize where organizing can take place, in which sense, what do we address there? So it was, but okay, it's one experience. I don't claim any expertise in playing with instructions of the double. Actually, I hope maybe if others might try to see if it's a tool. But
Yeah, it reminds me also a lot on the everybody's choreographic methods, which were developed like late 90s, beginning of the 21st century, which is a very interesting approach. And it's also very much connected to organization. I think it's very interesting in that sense. Is there somebody else who would like to?
I think I just step in with a tiny more question of understanding on this, because I also find it very interesting. I mean, on the one side, this health issue, this also environmental approach on the working space, to see the body as unit with the space, but this and also to relook it with the knowledge we have now, from environmental questions, and really reshape also the question of working and what it means. And these instructions to the double, is it more, because I didn't fully understand what this practice is. So it's first of all a description of the working process or the working place itself. It's not yet reorganization of it. No.
It's a description of like the full day of the workers. So it doesn't just start at the factory gate. So it was like, okay, would you have breakfast? How do you get to work? Do you commute? We were talking about commuting before we opened the chat. Okay, do you get to the factory on time or not? Are you struggling with timing? What did you have for breakfast? How did you sleep? And so forth and so on. And then it progresses into the typical actions that the individual worker would carry out through the day. So, how do you do things, not just what things do you do? It shifts in a Deleuzian way, the background story. And apparently it was very difficult for workers. And it is, if you ever try to describe someone, like, how do you read your emails? It opens up a self-reflexivity around all the, all the tics and fears and preferences and why you do this one way or another. So those were the kinds of conversations that O'Donnell was trying to sustain and open up as a way for the workers to talk to each other. And also so with two goals in mind. One was to avoid to stay on the level of the flat description that is caught up in replicating the master's voice, because when you describe your job, you usually give your job description, right?
Yeah.
So that was a way to also disavow that. And on the other hand, it is a way for this experience to become both collective in the group, but also externalizable. And him as a kind of medical expert, he could then start to probably guess what are the connections and how come certain people get sick or have all kinds of problems. So there's a very pragmatic reason to ask these questions. But I don't know how often you go to medical checkups, all of us, but I don't think I've ever been asked once about my environment of work and condition of work. Not once. Like, they ask me if you smoke, do you drink, do you exercise, do you eat well? Have you ever been asked by a medical professional any information about the kind of daily grind that we spend most of the day doing? And I think there is a lot to be said about that. Even in our day and age, even in our class and kind of, white European privileged context, still this is a taboo, even though probably nothing major would jump out as a risk factor, but we don't know because you were not asked about that. So I think that was the kind of push that he wanted to introduce, because then if the doctor can ask these questions, there's real consequences also for where the responsibility of the medical class would end. It troubles that kind of. No, I don't know. Sorry, I hope I clarified for everyone what the exercise was about.
I was just thinking, just to add a small thought, I was just thinking you are only asked if you cannot work anymore. And that goes back to the start of your lecture. Then you are asked with your practitioner. So it's interesting. Because then it's, of course, an illness. And then you are asked. Huh? It's interesting, what you're saying. Mm-hmm. Are there some more questions or comments? Would somebody like to add something? No? Because I would then just ask something what is still on my mind. And I was thinking, we don't need to go more into it, but I was just thinking how interesting this is, what you brought also with Laurent Berlant, with rereading this text about slow death. If we are rereading it in a current pandemic situation and the way how people who don't want to vaccinate, they are addressed. And I was also thinking like that very often it's perceived through the notion of crisis. And then the address always fails because it addressed a lot of like them like active subject. Like it's this kind of what you said, that there is this problem of, either they are internet obsessed or paranoid and there is actually total frustration how to reach the people in these public discussions on health. And it shows a lot how health is understood also. That we are responsible, we have to be active. And there is something very interesting to reread the Berlant text to understand what is going on with this passivity or rejection and so on. And I was just thinking, this is for me really interesting to again think about something else and not that the active subject is always addressed and it has to react and so on. So it's a very interesting connection to that. And you also yourself mentioned these current problems with the scientific knowledge and so on, but it would be super interesting to think about it through the perspective of Berlant. Yeah, that everyday, ordinary pragmatism and how to address it now.
Yeah, no, it's definitely on my mind how we articulate this the health in this moment, because it's so connoted, and I don't even need to make the list of the things that are in everybody's back of the mind: anti-vax, conspiracy, but also biopolitics and green passes and lockdowns and mismanagements and WHO and so forth. Yeah. But at the same time, it's also interesting because one line of discourse that one hears a lot in the left, let's call it left, but again, I'm aware that please, if somebody has a better word to offer me, I would be grateful. But anyway, some people are striving for social justice values, let's put it this way. It's hard to articulate a position. It's breaking up movements in many contexts that I know of. What do you do? Is it what works? What doesn't? It's not an easy topic, and it's intractable. That's what's interesting, because it's not it's not a problem of ideological divisions. It's a problem of strategy, of tactic and pragmatic how. And what I was trying to suggest is that if we depart from this idea that health might need to be a byproduct, then it asks us to consider the regimes of practice that get us there, that they need to be lateral. And so it is an organizing question. It cannot be a demonstrative question. And it's definitely not a problem of public sphere, as in like who's got the better argument and the rhetoric, and because we know that does not open up many doors, or at least I don't know many people that change their mind in that way. I don't know anybody who changed their mind in that way. So it needs to convoke experiences that are not supported by many institutions right now. And that for me seems perhaps a way to start in concrete ways. I'm aware, by the way, that I did not get to this part at all. But in my title, I did mention the peripatetic as a methodology. And this is something to do with, it's a highbrow word to just speak about the practice of specific schools of ancient philosophers that would just walk, and they would conceive of thinking as a byproduct of walking together. And this is interesting for me because it evokes this lack of a place to, like a lack of institution for specific desires, but still this capacity of making conditions by pragmatically doing and taking a walk, even if only that, and as a principle of opening that time out.
Thank you very much, Valeria, for that, sharing your thoughts, and I'm very much looking forward how this will develop, and maybe we really go for a walk or a short walk afterwards. So I would like to thank you all for listening and being present.
Thank you.
And I wish you really a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria.
Ciao.